Hello and welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's tale, don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment so you won't miss any of our bedtime stories. Every story has its own mystery, its own pulse, and its own shadow lingering behind the words. Now, let's step into tonight's true story. The fire on Maple Street in Austin, Texas. It was a quiet evening Thursday, the 18th of August, 2022. The air in Austin was heavy with the late summer heat, the kind that clings to your skin even after the sun has set. Maple Street, a narrow road lined with oak and pecan trees, usually carried the gentle rhythm of suburban life. The barking of dogs, the hum of air conditioners, and the faint laughter of children still playing outside even after dusk. At around 9:37 p.m., that rhythm was broken. A sharp crack, like glass shattering, echoed from the home of Margaret Ellis, a 64-year-old retired librarian who had lived in the neighborhood for more than 3 decades. Within moments, smoke began to seep out from the attic windows, curling upward, glowing faintly orange as the flames caught hold. Margaret's neighbor, Thomas Green, a middle-aged man from Liverpool who had moved to Texas 5 years earlier for work, was one of the first to notice. He had just returned from his late shift at a downtown hotel. Standing on his porch with a cup of tea, an old English habit he had never abandoned, he froze when he saw the smoke thickening above Margaret's roof. The atmosphere shifted quickly. The calm of Maple Street dissolved into shouts, hurried footsteps, and the shrill wail of sirens approaching from the distance. Neighbors poured out of their homes, some barefoot, some still in their night clothes. The Texan heat, combined with the acrid smell of burning wood, made it difficult to breathe. Thomas set his mug aside and dashed toward Margaret's house. He knew she lived alone, except for her gray tabby cat named Oliver. The windows were hot to the touch, and the wooden front door rattled with the pressure from inside. He could hear Margaret's faint cries from within, her voice trembling, lost between the roar of the fire and the creak of beams giving way. By the time the Austin Fire Department trucks rolled in at 9:45 p.m., flames had already consumed much of the roof. Firefighters leapt out with practiced speed, dragging hoses across the lawn, shouting orders to one another. The glow of emergency lights painted the trees red and blue, flashing against the smoke like some distorted festival of color. Margaret was still inside. Thomas and another neighbor, Rachel McCarthy, who had moved from Manchester the previous year with her young son, tried desperately to reach her. Rachel kept calling Margaret's name, her voice strained and cracking, while Thomas pressed against the door with his shoulder, sweat dripping down his forehead. The heat forced them back more than once, each time harsher than before. The firemen stormed forward, axes in hand, breaking open the door at last. A rush of thick smoke poured out, blinding and suffocating. The crowd of neighbors stumbled backward, covering their mouths and noses, their faces glowing in the firelight. Somewhere in the back, a child began to cry, clinging tightly to his mother's waist. Inside, the search had begun. 2 firefighters vanished into haze, their silhouettes moving like shadows swallowed by an orange storm. And as the neighborhood stood in tense silence, every second felt like an hour. The only sound was a crash of burning timber, the hiss of water hitting flames, and the desperate murmur of prayers whispered into the night. The night on Maple Street was far from ordinary. Every breath carried the bitter taste of smoke, and every glance toward Margaret Ellis's house was filled with fear and helplessness. The fire that started quietly in the attic now raged like a beast unchained, spreading across the roof, consuming the shingles one by one. Thomas Green stood near the edge of the driveway, his chest heaving as he coughed, his shirt already damp with sweat. Rachel McCarthy held her son close, whispering in his ear to keep him calm, though her own eyes betrayed the fear she tried to conceal. The flashing red and blue lights from the fire engines bounced off the windows of neighboring houses, casting strange moving shadows across the lawns. The firefighters moved with urgency, each step deliberate and purposeful. Captain Michael Ramirez, a seasoned firefighter with more than 20 years of experience, barked orders as he adjusted his helmet. His voice cut through the chaos, commanding, steady, unyielding. Two of his men disappeared inside, armed with axes and flashlights, their oxygen tanks hissing as they moved deeper into thickening smoke. From outside, the neighborhood had fallen into a tense vigil. People stood in small clusters, hands clasped in silent prayer, their eyes fixed on the door that now stood broken and scorched. The sound of crackling flames mingled with the steady spray of water pounding against the house. Yet still, the fire refused to surrender. Margaret's cry had been faint, but it was enough to fuel hope. She was alive, somewhere inside that collapsing frame of timber and brick. Thomas paced along the sidewalk, every second feeling like an eternity. He thought of Margaret as he had always known her, a quiet woman with soft white hair, who wore round glasses perched low on her nose. She spent her afternoons tending to her roses, always greeting passers-by with a gentle nod. Oliver the cat often sat by her feet, blinking lazily in the sun. To think of her trapped in this inferno was unbearable. Inside the burning home, the heat was suffocating. Firefighter Daniel Lopez gripped his axe tightly, using it to clear debris as he and his partner, Jordan Hayes, pressed forward. Their visibility was almost zero, the beam of their flashlights swallowed quickly by the dense smoke. They could hear the groaning of the house, the way an old ship groans before sinking. Each creak a reminder that the structure might not hold much longer. They shouted her name, their voices muffled by their masks. A faint reply came, distant and weak, from somewhere beyond the staircase. Daniel felt a surge of adrenaline. They pushed forward, navigating collapsing hallway where flames licked the walls, the wallpaper curling like dry leaves. Back outside, Rachel clutched her son tighter, rocking him gently as the boy buried his face in her chest. The neighbors murmured in hushed tones. Some filmed the scene on their phones, though most could not look away from the door, waiting, hoping, praying. At 9:57 p.m., the firefighters emerged, dragging Margaret between them. She was frail, her body limp, her clothes singed and streaked with soot. A mask covered her face as she gasped for air, barely conscious. The crowd erupted, not in cheers, but in sighs of relief, in cries of gratitude, in whispered words of thanks that floated up into the smoky night. Thomas rushed forward instinctively, though an EMT quickly raised a hand to hold him back. Margaret was lowered onto a stretcher, paramedics surrounding her, checking her pulse, her breathing, her eyes. Oliver, her tabby cat, was nowhere in sight. That small detail pierced Thomas like a blade, but he dared not speak it aloud. The fire was far from over. Flames still surged through the attic, and Captain Ramirez shouted for his crew to continue pouring water onto the roof. Neighbors were urged to step back further, as sparks drifted like fireflies through the air, carried by the hot wind. Some of those sparks landed on the dry grass of the lawns, smoldering before being stamped out by hurried feet. The night grew darker, though the street was bathed in the unnatural glow of fire. The air was thick with ash, which settled on cars, porches, and even the leaves of trees. It felt as though Maple Street had been transported into another world, a place of smoke and flame where time stretched and fear lingered. As Margaret was rushed into the waiting ambulance, Thomas found himself walking alongside, his steps almost involuntary. He wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to assure her she was not alone. But the doors closed before he could, and the ambulance pulled away, its siren wailing as it disappeared into the night. For a moment, silence fell upon the street, broken only by the hiss of hoses and crack of collapsing wood. Then the questions began, whisper at first, then louder. How had it started? Was it the wiring? A candle? The stove? Nobody knew. What they knew was only this. Their neighbor's life had hung by a thread, and the flames had come frighteningly close to claiming more than just one home. Thomas leaned against the hood of a car, his head in his hands. Rachel approached quietly, her son now asleep in her arms. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "She's alive," she said, as though reminding him, reminding herself. He nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of Margaret's fragile body, or the memory of her voice calling faintly from within the fire. And there was Oliver, the cat, still unaccounted for, possibly lost in the flames. By 10:30 p.m., the fire had been brought under control. The roof was gone, blackened beams jutting into the night sky like broken teeth. Water streamed down the driveway, carrying ash and fragments of charred wood. Firefighters remained, working tirelessly to ensure no embers reignited. The neighbors began to drift back toward their homes, some offering blankets and water, others making quiet phone calls to relatives. But sleep would not come easily for anyone on Maple Street that night. The fire had scarred not just a house, but a community. Thomas stayed behind long after most had gone inside. He stood at the curb, staring at the smoking ruin of Margaret's home. He thought of his own house, just a few doors down, still intact, still whole. The fragility of it all weighed heavily on him. He remembered nights back in Liverpool, cold and damp, when he never once thought of fire as a threat. Texas was different. Everything here seemed bigger, harsher, more unpredictable. At 11:12 p.m., a firefighter approached him, pulling off his helmet to wipe sweat from his brow. It was Daniel Lopez, the one who had carried Margaret out. "She's lucky," Daniel said simply. His voice was tired, his face streaked with ash. Another 5 minutes, and it would have been too late. Thomas swallowed hard. "Did you see a cat inside?" "Gray tabby." Daniel shook his head slowly. "We didn't see him, but sometimes they hide." He could have made it out. The uncertainty gnawed at Thomas, though he forced himself to cling to the possibility. As the last of the fire crews began packing up, Maple Street was left in an uneasy quiet. The smell of smoke lingered, woven into the very fabric of the night. The neighbors, though safe, carried the weight of what they had witnessed. And Thomas, standing alone beneath the flickering street lamp, knew that this night would not leave him easily. For the fire on Maple Street was not just a blaze that consumed wood and glass. It was a reminder of how quickly life could tilt from ordinary to extraordinary, from safe to perilous, from quiet to chaos. And though the flames were out, their shadow remained. The smoke lingered long after the flames were extinguished. By midnight, the night sky above Austin was clearer, though the air on Maple Street still carried the acrid scent of charred timber and melted plastic. Ash settled across the lawns like a thin layer of gray snow. The once familiar home of Margaret Ellis was now little more than a blackened skeleton. Its roof collapsed, its windows blown out, its garden scorched by falling embers. Neighbors had returned indoors one by one, though lights still burned in many houses. Curtains shifted, revealing silhouettes peering out at the ruin across the street. For some, sleep was impossible. The sight of fire consuming a home so close to their own had left their nerves raw. For others, the smell of smoke itself was a reminder that safety could be fleeting. Thomas Green remained by the curb long after most had gone. His tea had long since gone cold on his porch, forgotten in the chaos. The sirens had faded, the fire engines gone, but his thoughts churned endlessly. He replayed the moments when Margaret's cries reached him through the crackling wood, when her frail body was carried out on a stretcher. And in every replay, the thought of Oliver, the missing cat, struck him like a knife. He could not help but imagine the small creature hiding beneath the bed, cornered by fire and smoke, waiting for a rescue that never came. At midnight, Rachel McCarthy returned quietly to the street. Her son slept upstairs, finally calmed by exhaustion. She carried 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling into the night. She approached Thomas slowly, handing one to him without a word. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He took a sip, though the bitter taste of smoke clung even to the coffee. Rachel stood beside him, staring at the wreckage. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "I was just speaking to her yesterday morning. She was trimming her roses, asking me about school for Jamie. And now—" Her words trailed off into the night air. Thomas nodded. "It's frightening. How fast it happens. One moment everything's ordinary. The next—" He gestured toward the ruin, unable to finish the thought. They stood in silence for a long while, listening to the soft crackle of embers and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. For all its noise and chaos, the city seemed strangely absent from Maple Street, as though this small corner had been cut off, left to its own haunted quiet. When Thomas finally returned inside, he left his windows open despite the smell. He could not bear the thought of being shut away, blind to the outside, as though nothing had happened. He sat in his living room armchair until dawn, the first light of morning painting the smoke-stained houses in shades of gray and gold. News spread quickly. By Friday morning, reporters had arrived, their vans parked along the street. Cameras pointed at the ruin. Journalists spoke in rehearsed tones about the devastating fire that shook a quiet neighborhood, while neighbors avoided their lenses, embarrassed by the intrusion. At St. David's Medical Center, Margaret lay in a hospital bed, her breathing steady but weak. Doctors confirmed she had suffered smoke inhalation and minor burns, but she was expected to recover. For the neighborhood, that news was a fragile beacon of hope, a reminder that the night had not claimed a life, though it had destroyed so much else. By afternoon, the community gathered. Some brought food for firefighters who had returned to check for hot spots. Others spoke in hushed groups, sharing theories of what might have started the fire. Wiring, some said. Others insisted it must have been the old stove or a candle left burning. No one knew for certain. Thomas visited the hospital that evening. He carried a bouquet of flowers, white lilies, the only ones left at the florist. He felt awkward stepping into her room, unsure she would want company so soon. But when she opened her eyes and saw him, her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You were there," she whispered, her voice raspy. "I heard you." Thomas swallowed hard. "I tried to reach you, but it was too hot. The firemen, they got to you in time." Her eyes closed again, tired. "Oliver," she breathed. He hesitated. "We haven't found him yet, but cats are clever. He could be hiding." She gave a faint nod, though the sadness in her expression lingered. Back on Maple Street, the shell of her house remained cordoned off by yellow tape. At night, the silence was heavier than before, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional hiss of a sprinkler turning on automatically. But for the residents, the rhythm of life had been disturbed. People checked their smoke alarms twice, some even 3 times. Parents tucked their children into bed with reassurances they weren't sure they believed themselves. Over the weekend, volunteers arrived. Neighbors gathered in Margaret's garden, salvaging what little had survived. A few books had been spared, though their pages were singed. A picture frame with a family photograph lay cracked but intact. Every item was laid carefully into boxes, as though fragments of memory could be preserved from a ruin. Rachel organized a community fundraiser, spreading the word through social media. By Sunday, donations began pouring in, not only from neighbors, but from strangers across Austin, even from old friends in the United Kingdom who had known Margaret through her years as a librarian. Stories surfaced of her kindness, of the way she had once stayed late to help a child learn to read, of the quiet patience with which she had guided countless students. Thomas found himself at the center of it all, though he never sought the attention. People call him a hero for rushing toward the fire, for trying to break down the door. He denied it each time, insisting he had done what anyone would. But late at night, when the house was quiet, the word echoed in his mind, mingled with the lingering images of smoke and flame. On Monday, something unexpected happened. A firefighter returned to Maple Street, carrying a small carrier. Inside, covered in soot but very much alive, was Oliver. He had been found hiding beneath a collapsed section of the porch, too frightened to move. His fur was singed, his whiskers shortened by the heat, but when Thomas opened the carrier, the cat leapt into his arms, purring weakly. The news spread like wildfire of its own kind. Neighbors cheered, children clapped, and when Margaret was told in her hospital bed, tears ran down her cheeks for the first time since the fire. Oliver became the small miracle in the middle of destruction, a symbol that not everything had been lost. Days turned into weeks, and Maple Street slowly regained its rhythm. The smell of smoke faded, replaced once again by the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming pecan trees. Margaret moved in temporarily with her sister across town, while plans for rebuilding her house began. Contractors arrived, sketches were drawn, and though the road ahead was long, there was movement, there was hope. For Thomas and Rachel, the fire left a mark deeper than ash. It tied them to one another, to Margaret, to the community in ways they hadn't expected. On quiet evenings, they still spoke of that night, of the moment the sirens arrived, of the fear that gripped their hearts, of the relief when Margaret was carried out alive. And yet, even as time softened the edges of memory, Maple Street never quite returned to what was before. Each resident carried with them the knowledge of how fragile it all was, how quickly the ordinary could be undone. And every time a siren sounded in the distance, every time the scent of smoke drifted on the wind, they remembered the fire on Maple Street was no longer just a single night in Austin. It became a story passed from neighbor to neighbor, told quietly at barbecues and school events, retold to new families who moved in, always with the same mixture of dread and gratitude. It became part of the identity of the street itself, etched into its history like a scar. And as for Thomas, each evening when he set his cup of tea on the porch, he found himself glancing toward Margaret's garden, now empty but not forgotten. The roses would bloom again one day. The house would rise from its ashes. And the shadows of that August night, though they lingered, would never be stronger than the light that followed. Autumn came to Austin slowly, as it always did. By late September, the heat still lingered, but the nights grew cooler, and the pecan trees along Maple Street began to drop their leaves in golden clusters across the sidewalks. The blackened remains of Margaret's home stood stark against the neighborhood, a reminder that summer's violence had not been washed away with the rains. For weeks after the fire, construction crews came and went. They cleared debris, tore down unsafe walls, and left behind an empty lot where a home once stood. For many on the street, the absence felt louder than the fire itself. Where once Margaret's roses had grown along the front fence, there was now only soil, scorched and bare. Margaret stayed with her sister, Elaine, across town. Her recovery was steady, though she walked with slowness that had not been there before. The smoke had scarred her lungs, and the burns on her arms had left faint patterns of pink skin. But her spirit, though shaken, remained intact. She returned to Maple Street as often as she could, sitting on a folding chair by the lot where her house had stood. Neighbors stopped by to greet her, to remind her she was still part of them, not just a victim of fire, but a thread in the fabric of the street. Thomas made a habit of visiting her whenever she came. Sometimes he brought Oliver, now healthy again, though still skittish around loud noises. The cat would curl up in Margaret's lap as she stroked his fur, her fingers trembling only slightly. "You saved me that night," she told Thomas one afternoon in October, her voice soft as the sun dipped low behind the trees. He shook his head. "The firefighters did. I only tried. I couldn't get past the heat." "But you tried," she repeated firmly, her eyes fixed on him. "And that means something. In moments like that, not everyone runs toward the fire. You did." Her words stayed with him, though he rarely spoke of them. He continued with his life, working his shifts at the hotel downtown, caring for his modest house, helping Rachel with errands when she needed it. Yet the fire had carved a place inside him that could not be filled. At night, he sometimes woke to the phantom sound of crackling wood, the sight of orange flames behind his eyelids. The community, too, carried its scars. Every household installed new smoke alarms. Some bought fire extinguishers for the first time. Parents taught their children escape routes, drills that seemed unnecessary before, but now felt vital. The sound of sirens anywhere in Austin sent a ripple of unease through Maple Street, and conversations paused until it was clear the danger lay elsewhere. By December, rebuilding began. The foundations for Margaret's new home were laid. The work funded by insurance, community donations, and quiet contributions from neighbors who never wanted her to feel alone. It became a project larger than one person's recovery. It was a symbol for Maple Street itself, a declaration that fire might scar but not erase, might break but not defeat. The winter holidays arrived, and though Margaret was not yet back in her home, the community gathered around her. Rachel hosted Christmas dinner, inviting Margaret, Thomas, and several others. Candles glowed in the windows, and a small artificial tree stood in the corner, decorated with ornaments Rachel's son, Jamie, had made at school. For a few hours, laughter replaced memory, and Margaret, wrapped in a wool shawl, smiled more than she had since before the fire. The new year came quietly. January mornings in Austin were brisk, the kind that carried mist over the lawns until the sun burned it away. Work on Margaret's house continued, walls rising slowly, beams reaching upward where once there had been only ash. Thomas walked by every evening after his shift, pausing to watch the progress. It felt almost like watching hope take shape, brick by brick. But progress was not only measured in wood and mortar. Margaret began to heal in ways that surprised even her. She volunteered at the local library again, though only part-time. Children flocked to her, as they always had, listening to her read stories aloud, her voice still carrying the warmth of someone who believed in the power of books. Rachel found herself changed too. She had moved from Manchester for a new start, and though the fire had terrified her, it also connected her more deeply to this place she had chosen. She and Thomas often spoke in evenings, their conversations drifting from small talk to memories, from fears to dreams. In those talks, the fire was never far, but it became less of a wound and more of a thread that bound them together. By spring, the garden bloomed again. Neighbors planted roses along the edge of Margaret's lot, a gift to welcome her home when construction was complete. Children played along the sidewalks once more, their laughter carrying on the breeze. The street regained its rhythm, though its heart now beat with a deeper awareness of fragility. May arrived, and with it, the anniversary of the fire. On the evening of the 18th, the community gathered quietly in front of Margaret's nearly finished house. They lit candles, standing in a circle beneath the pecan trees. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of blossoms, yet charged with memory. Margaret, leaning on Thomas's arm, spoke softly to those gathered. "We lost so much that night," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But we also found something. We found that we are not alone, that when flames threaten to take everything, it is our neighbors, our friends, who stand beside us, and that is stronger than fire." The candles flickered, their flame small but steady, each one a quiet defiance of the darkness. When summer returned, Margaret moved back into her rebuilt home. The walls were fresh, the windows clear, the garden replanted. It was not the same house, not the same roses, not the same shelves of books she had lost. But it was hers once more, and it stood where the fire had tried to erase it. On the first evening she spent back on Maple Street, Thomas brought over a pot of tea, and Rachel brought biscuits baked that morning. They sat together on the porch as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the street. Oliver the cat lay curled at Margaret's feet, purring softly, as if to remind them that survival was possible, even for the smallest among them. The fire on Maple Street did not vanish from memory. It lived on in whispered stories, in the way neighbors looked out for one another, in the way children knew where to run if danger came. But it also lived on in the bonds it created, in the strength it revealed, in the roses that once again bloomed along the fence. And every evening, when the air cooled and the world grew quiet, The street carried both its scars and its hope side by side, as naturally as the turning of the seasons. The fire trucks lingered on Maple Street far longer than anyone expected. Their red lights painted the trees and the brick walls of the houses in waves of color, pulsing like a heartbeat. By the time the last flame was smothered, it was well past 3 in the morning, and the neighborhood looked as if it had been pulled through a nightmare. The sharp smell of burnt timber hung in the air, mixed with the bitter tang of melted plastic and singed paint. Even the stars above Austin seemed dim by the haze. Helen Gardner, who lived across the street from the ruined house, sat on the curb with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her husband, Mark, stood beside her, arms folded tightly, eyes fixed on the smoking wreck. They had lived on Maple Street for nearly 20 years, raising their 2 children here, never one imagining they would see one of the homes on their quiet road swallowed by fire. What started it? Helen whispered, as if the question itself might upset the fragile silence. No one knows yet, Mark replied, shaking his head. The chief said they'll investigate in the morning. Could be electrical, could be something left on. God, I hope it wasn't deliberate. Helen shivered, not from cold, but from the thought of how quickly their street, usually so calm and familiar, had turned into a stage for chaos. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, murmuring, pointing, speculating. Children who had been woken by the sirens clung to their parents' hands, their eyes wide and unblinking. Some were crying quietly, overwhelmed by the sight of firefighters dragging blackened hoses, their boots leaving muddy tracks on lawns that had always seemed pristine. At the far end of the crowd, Detective Michael Harris arrived. His dark sedan pulled up without sirens, headlights cutting through the smoke. He stepped out, adjusting his tie despite the late hour, and made his way toward the fire chief. Harris was known in the Austin Police Department for his patience and quiet determination. He wasn't a man of flashy entrances, but the weight of his presence was always felt. Chief Morales greeted him with a tired nod. Detective, didn't expect you tonight. Big fire like this, Morales? People will want answers. Might as well get started, Harris replied, his voice calm, but his eyes sharp as he scanned the wreckage. The house that had burned belonged to the Carter family. Thomas and Lily Carter were a middle-aged couple with a teenage son, Ethan. They had lived in Austin for nearly a decade, known to be private but polite. Now, their home was nothing but a husk, windows shattered, roof partially collapsed, the once white siding blackened and curling. The Carters themselves stood apart from the crowd, wrapped in blankets provided by the Red Cross volunteers who had already begun circulating. Lily's face was pale, streaked with soot and tears. Thomas tried to stand tall, his hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder, but the weight of loss pressed visibly on him. Detective Harris approached them carefully. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I'm Detective Harris. I'm so sorry for what happened. I know this is a terrible night, but if you're able, I need to ask you a few questions. Thomas nodded slowly. Of course. Anything to help. Were you all at home when it started? Harris asked. Lily shook her head, her voice trembling. We were at Ethan's school concert over on Barton Springs Road. We only got back when the fire trucks were already here. We couldn't do anything. Ethan looked down at the ground, his sneakers blackened from ash where he had wandered too close. He muttered, almost too softly to hear, I told you I smelled something weird earlier. Harris's gaze sharpened. When did you notice that, Ethan? The boy lifted his eyes, red-rimmed but steady. Yesterday, in the garage. Like gas or chemicals. I told Dad, but he said it was probably the lawnmower. Thomas's shoulders stiffened. I did check it. Nothing seemed wrong. Harris made a note, the small detail already carving a path in his mind. Around them, Maple Street felt heavy with unease. The neighbors wanted to comfort the Carters, but fear kept them cautious. The fire hadn't touched their homes, yet the idea that it could have spread, that it could happen to any of them, pressed down like a weight. The Gardners whispered with the Millers. The Coopers stood close to the Owens family, everyone circling the same question. Was this an accident or something darker? As the night stretched on, paramedics checked the Carters for smoke inhalation. Volunteers handed out bottles of water, and slowly, one by one, the neighbors returned indoors, though few would sleep easily. Detective Harris lingered near the ruins. He crouched close to the ground, running a hand through the damp grass where the hoses had flooded it. He could still feel the faint heat radiating from the wreck. There was something about the burn pattern, how it spread so quickly, how it seemed to leap from the garage outward, that gnawed at his instincts. He had seen fires before. This one felt unnatural. At 4:30 in the morning, the last fire engine pulled away, leaving only silence and the occasional drip of water from scorched beams. Harris stayed a little longer, speaking quietly with Morales. "Do you think it was arson?" the chief asked, almost reluctant. Harris didn't answer immediately. He watched as a single ember glowed faintly in the ruins before fading into blackness. Finally, he stood, his expression unreadable. "I think," he said slowly, "that Maple Street is not going to be the same after tonight." The following morning, Maple Street did not wake to its usual calm rhythm. Normally, Saturdays meant lawnmowers humming by mid-morning, the smell of fresh coffee drifting through open kitchen windows, and children riding bicycles up and down the sidewalks. But this morning was different. The air was heavy with a lingering odor of smoke, and the sight of the blackened Carter residence pulled everyone's attention like a magnet. Curtains twitched as neighbors peeked outside, hesitant to step fully into the daylight that revealed how much their quiet street had changed overnight. Detective Michael Harris returned just after 7. He had managed only a few hours of sleep, yet his mind had never left the fire. He parked his unmarked sedan by the curb and stepped out, greeted immediately by the hollow silence of destruction. Yellow tape cordoned off the perimeter of the house, fluttering faintly in the morning breeze. Inside the line, fire marshals moved deliberately, photographing charred beams, collecting samples, noting points of origin. Harris approached Chief Morales, who was crouched near what had once been the garage. "Morning," Harris said quietly. Morales gave a curt nod, his face drawn with fatigue. "Morning. It's worse than I thought when the sun was down. The structure's unstable, but we've got a team documenting everything. Burn pattern suggests it started right here." He pointed toward the garage corner. "But what's odd is how fast it traveled, almost like it had help." Harris knelt to inspect the ground. The concrete was cracked from the heat, but on the edges, faint traces of a liquid stain shimmered against the soot. He touched it carefully with a gloved hand, brought it to his nose, and caught a whiff of something acrid. "Accelerant?" he asked. Morales frowned. "Looks that way. Too early to confirm, but I don't like it." Beyond the tape, neighbors had begun gathering in small knots, whispering, pointing, and clutching their coffee mugs as if for comfort. Harris could feel the weight of their stares. On a street where everyone knew each other's names, suspicion was a foreign intruder, but already it hovered in the air, unseen but palpable. At the Gardner house, Helen stood with Mark on their porch, watching the investigators. She turned to her husband, voice hushed. If it was deliberate, who would do something like this? The Carters kept to themselves, but they weren't unkind. Mark exhaled slowly. "That's what worries me. If it wasn't about them, maybe it was about someone else." Meanwhile, the Carters had been relocated to a nearby motel with the help of Red Cross volunteers. Harris decided it was time to speak with them again. He drove across town, arriving at a modest roadside in where the family had been placed in a ground floor room. He knocked gently. Thomas answered, looking 10 years older than he had the night before. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair uncombed, and his eyes red from lack of sleep. "Detective," he said, forcing politeness. "Come in." Inside, Lily sat on the edge of the bed, her hands twisting a tissue until it tore. Ethan was slouched in a chair by the window, staring out at the parking lot where cars came and went. Harris pulled up a chair and sat across from them. "I know this is difficult," he began, "but I need to ask again about anything unusual leading up to last night. Ethan mentioned smelling something strange in the garage. Did either of you notice anything else? Any visitors? Deliveries?" Thomas rubbed his forehead. "No visitors. No deliveries. Just normal days." But Lily's eyes shifted slightly before she spoke. "There was one thing," she said softly. "2 nights ago, I heard someone outside. I thought it was just a raccoon knocking over bins. But when I looked out, I swear I saw a shadow moving near the garage. I didn't wake Thomas. I thought I was imagining it." Harris leaned forward. "Can you describe the shadow? Tall, short man, woman?" "It was quick," Lily admitted, "but I think it was a man. Tall. He moved fast, disappeared between the trees." Ethan turned suddenly. "See? I wasn't imagining things either. Something's been off." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Why didn't you say that last night?" Lily's voice broke. "Because I didn't want to believe it. And now look." She gestured helplessly toward the window, as if the charred remains of their home could be seen all the way from the motel. Harris noted everything, his pen scratching steadily. A possible intruder, the smell of chemicals and accelerant traces. It was lining up toward arson. But the bigger question loomed. Why? By midday, Maple Street had transformed into a stage of activity. Reporters arrived, setting up cameras, their voices carrying as they delivered updates to local stations. Curious onlookers drove slowly by, necks craning to see the ruins. Neighbors grew uneasy, suddenly aware that their private tragedy had become public spectacle. Helen Gardner felt compelled to do something. She gathered a few of the women from the street, Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Owens, and a younger neighbor, Jessica Miller, and suggested preparing meals for Carters. "They've lost everything," Helen said. "The least we can do is feed them for now." Jessica, who had always been friendly with Ethan at school events, nodded eagerly. "I'll make lasagna. That boy needs something warm in his stomach." As they busied themselves in kitchens, the men gathered separately, discussing practical matters. Should they raise funds? Should they push the city for stronger patrols? Beneath their conversations, however, lay a nervous edge, an unspoken fear that one of them might be connected, somehow, to the fire. That evening, Harris returned to Maple Street to continue interviews. He spoke with each household, asking about noises, strangers, disputes. Most had nothing to report, though several admitted hearing a car engine idling late at night in recent weeks. One neighbor, Mr. Owens, claimed he had seen a dark pickup truck parked near the Carters' driveway a week before. He couldn't recall the license plate, but the memory stuck with him because the truck didn't belong to anyone on the street. Harris filed it away. A truck, a shadow, a smell of fuel. It was building into a picture, though the edges remained blurry. As night fell again, Maple Street grew quieter, but the calm was fragile. Porch lights stayed on longer than usual. Blinds were shut tightly, and dogs barked nervously at passing footsteps. The once trusted familiarity of the neighborhood had been fractured. In his motel bed, Ethan tossed and turned, replaying the image of flames devouring his room, his posters, his guitar. He kept hearing the faint hiss of fire in his dreams. Around 2 a.m, he sat up restless and glanced out the motel window. In the shadows of the parking lot, for the briefest moment, he thought he saw the silhouette of that same tall figure, standing perfectly still before vanishing behind a row of cars. He froze, breath caught in his throat, unsure if it was exhaustion playing tricks on him, or if the nightmare had followed them here. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on the shadow he thought he had seen, his pulse hammering in his chest. He rubbed his face with both hands, whispering to himself, "It's just my imagination. I'm tired. That's all." Yet, when he leaned closer to the window, pressing his forehead to the cold glass, the parking lot lay still and empty, only a flickering streetlight above and the silhouettes of parked cars. He sat back in the chair, pulling the blanket around him. Sleep seemed impossible now. The hiss of fire in his dreams had already stolen rest from him, and the thought that someone might be following them made his stomach twist. He considered waking his parents, but hesitated. They were already carrying so much. Instead, he turned on the motel television, lowering the volume until it was barely audible, and let the soft murmur of late-night news anchor him in something familiar. Across town, Detective Harris sat in his apartment, notes spread out across the table. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. He kept circling the same facts. The smell of fuel in the garage, Lily's glimpse of a tall figure, the reports of a pickup truck, and now traces of accelerant. He knew too well that fires like this rarely happen by chance. But he also knew how delicate these cases could be. One wrong assumption, and the truth might slip away. The following morning, Harris visited the fire department's forensic lab. Samples collected from the Carter residence were already under preliminary analysis. A technician handed him a report. Gasoline traces confirmed, concentrated in the garage. It was no longer speculation. Someone had poured fuel to ignite the fire. Any idea on entry points? Harris asked. "Window latch was broken," the technician replied. "Could have been forced. Could have been loose before. Hard to say with the damage." It was enough for Harris to conclude one thing. This was intentional. But why target the Carters? He returned to Maple Street, the hum of daytime traffic contrasting sharply with the eerie stillness of the burned house. Reporters had thinned out, but the yellow tape still fluttered, reminding everyone that the investigation was far from over. Harris walked door to door again, hoping repetition might unearth something overlooked. At the Miller residence, young Jessica answered with a cautious smile. She was a year younger than Ethan, and they had often seen each other at school. Harris asked her the same questions he had asked before. Had she noticed anyone suspicious? Unfamiliar cars? Strange sounds? Jessica hesitated, then nodded. "Actually, last week, I thought I saw someone standing near the Carter's mailbox. It was dark, maybe 9 or 10 at night. I only noticed because I was taking out the trash. They didn't move when I looked, just stood there. I got scared and ran back inside." "Could you tell if it was a man?" Harris asked. She shrugged. "I think so. He was tall. That's all I know." The description echoed what Lily had said, and what Ethan believed he had glimpsed. A tall figure. A stranger who didn't belong on Maple Street. That afternoon, Harris arranged to meet with the Carters again. This time, he chose to speak with Ethan privately. The boy sat stiffly in the motel chair, arms crossed, but his eyes carried the weight of something unsaid. "You saw something last night, didn't you?" Harris asked gently. Ethan blinked, startled. "How do you know?" "Call a detective's instinct." "Tell me." Ethan lowered his voice. "I woke up around 2. I looked out the window, and I swear I saw him again. The same tall shadow. He was in the parking lot, just standing there. Then he disappeared." "Did you tell your parents?" Ethan shook his head. "They wouldn't believe me. They think I'm just scared because of the fire." Harris leaned forward, his tone serious. "Listen to me. What you saw matters. You're not imagining things. If someone wanted to hurt your family, they may not be finished." The boy swallowed hard, nodding. That evening, Harris requested a patrol car to circle the motel through the night. He knew it wasn't enough, but it would at least offer some reassurance. Still, the thought gnawed at him. Whoever had started that fire was bold enough to return. That meant unfinished business. Back on Maple Street, neighbors gathered at Helen Gardner's house for an impromptu meeting. The air buzzed with nervous energy as they sat in the living room, sipping coffee, exchanging theories. It must have been random, Mrs. Owens insisted. A drifter, maybe, someone who wandered through. But Mark shook his head. Random fires don't spread that fast. Whoever did this wanted it done right. The discussion grew tense, voices overlapping, suspicion creeping in. At one point, Mr. Cooper muttered, "What if it wasn't someone from outside? What if it was one of us?" The room fell silent. Eyes darted from face to face. No one wanted to say it aloud, but the thought had been there all along. Helen cleared her throat, trying to dispel the heaviness. We can't start pointing fingers at each other. That will only tear us apart. But even as she spoke, the seed of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, Harris worked late, tracing possible connections in the Carters' past. Thomas Carter had no criminal record. Lily was a school teacher. Ethan was a quiet student, no trouble. On paper, they were ordinary. Yet ordinary families didn't usually become targets. There had to be something more. By midnight, Harris returned to the motel to check on the patrol. The lot was quiet. The cruiser parked near the entrance. He walked to the Carters' room, tapped lightly on the door, and spoke briefly with Thomas, assuring him the investigation was progressing. When he returned to his car, he paused, scanning the shadows at the far end of the lot. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw movement, a figure slipping behind a dumpster. He hurried toward it, but when he arrived, there was nothing, only silence, the faint hum of traffic from the highway beyond. The sense of being watched lingered. The next day brought another shift in the atmosphere. A letter arrived for the Carters at the motel. No return address. Thomas opened it, his hands trembling. Inside was a single sheet of paper with scrawled handwriting. "You should have left long ago. This is only the beginning." When Harris saw the note, his expression hardened. He bagged it carefully for analysis, though he knew the paper trail might be thin. Whoever wrote it wanted fear more than secrecy. That night, Maple Street stayed awake again. Porch lights burned past midnight. Dogs barked at invisible shapes, and neighbors lay in bed, staring at ceilings, wondering who among them or beyond them was responsible. For the first time in years, Maple Street felt like a place where trust had vanished, leaving only smoke, suspicion, and the creeping dread that the fire was not an end, but the start of something far darker. Detective Harris had seen his share of strange cases, but there was something about the fire on Maple Street that refused to settle neatly in his mind. Each new detail only deepened the mystery, and now the threatening note shifted the tone entirely. This was no longer a question of arson alone. It was a message, a warning, maybe even a game. The Carters sat together in the motel room, the note lying on the small wooden table between them. Lily stared at it as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying if she looked long enough. Ethan sat cross-legged on the bed, silent, his face pale. Thomas paced back and forth, his anger bubbling over. "Why us?" he muttered. "What have we done to deserve this? We've lived quietly. We've kept to ourselves. We never had enemies." Harris watched him carefully. "Think again, Mr. Carter. Sometimes we make enemies without realizing it. Sometimes our past reaches further than we expect. I need you to tell me everything. Business partners, old neighbors, family disputes, anything unusual." Thomas stopped pacing. His mouth opened as if to answer, but then he closed it, shaking his head. "No, nothing." But Harris caught the hesitation, the way Thomas avoided his wife's eyes. There was something unsaid. Harris knew better than to press in front of the whole family. Instead, he slipped a letter into an evidence bag and promised, "We'll find out who's behind this. But until then, you all need to stay alert." That evening, Maple Street's uneasy calm fractured again. Rumors had begun to spread, fueled by gossip and fear. At the small corner cafe where neighbors often met for breakfast, conversations grew heated. "I heard Thomas owed money," Mr. Owen said, lowering his voice though everyone leaned closer to listen. "Nonsense," Mrs. Cooper replied sharply. "The Carters are good people. Lily teaches at the school. Do you really think she'd be part of something like that?" Mr. Owen shrugged. "Good people have secrets too. Look around." This wasn't random. Somebody wanted them out. The gossip worked its way back to Helen Gardner, who felt torn between sympathy for her neighbors and unease about the shadow of suspicion spreading down Maple Street. That night, when she tried to sleep, she found herself staring at the ceiling, wondering if perhaps one of the people she had known for years was hiding something terrible. Meanwhile, Harris pushed deeper. He requested background checks, financial records, and even spoke to Lily's colleagues at the school. All reported the same. Lily was kind, diligent, loved by her students. Nothing out of place. But Thomas's history told a different story. Before moving to Austin, he had worked in real estate in Dallas. There had been disputes, lawsuits even, over failed property deals. Nothing criminal, but enough to spark grudges. One name in particular appeared repeatedly. A man named Victor Harlan, a contractor who had lost a large sum of money after a project with Thomas collapsed. Harris filed the name away. 2 days later, a second note arrived. This time it wasn't delivered to the motel. It was found tucked under the windshield wiper of the Gardner's car, parked right outside their house. Helen discovered it when she went to buy groceries. The words were short, written in the same jagged hand as the first letter. "They're not the only ones who will burn." Helen's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped it. She rushed back inside, showing to Mark, who immediately called Harris. By the time the detective arrived, the entire street was on edge. Neighbors gathered in tense clusters, voices rising with fear. If the first fire had been terrifying, the second threat made it clear. Maple Street itself was a target. Harris addressed the crowd from Helen's porch, his voice steady. "I need everyone to remain calm. We are investigating this seriously. If you see anything suspicious, any vehicles, any strangers, even small details, report them immediately. Do not take risks. Do not spread rumors. Fear is exactly what this person wants." But even as he spoke, Harris knew the truth. Fear had already taken root. That night, extra patrol cars circled Maple Street, their headlights sweeping over driveways and mailboxes. Most neighbors kept their lights on. Some even stayed awake by their windows, determined not to let anything slip past unnoticed. Yet in the early hours of the morning, just after 3, a scream split the silence. It came from the Miller residence. Jessica's mother burst onto the porch, shouting for help. Smoke was curling from their garage. Firefighters arrived within minutes, dousing the small blaze before it could spread. Unlike the Carter house, this fire had not consumed the whole structure. It had been caught early, but the message was clear. It was not an accident. The accelerant smell was unmistakable. Jessica trembled in her mother's arms as Harris examined the scene. 2 fires in less than a week, both on the same street. This was no coincidence. Someone was stalking Maple Street, feeding on panic, determined to escalate. Harris crouched by the charred patch where the fire had started. He felt the same gnawing sensation as before, the sense of deliberate malice. Standing, he turned to the crowd of shaken neighbors who had gathered in their night clothes, watching with wide eyes. "Whoever is doing this," Harris said, his voice carrying into the heavy night air, "is watching us right now. Heads whipped around. People looked into the shadows, into the dark spaces between trees and fences, half expecting to see a figure staring back. But the street was empty, or appeared to be. Ethan, standing beside Jessica, whispered, "I can feel him. He's here." Harris didn't dismiss the boy's fear. In fact, he felt it too, the sense of eyes lingering just out of sight. The same tall shadow that had haunted Ethan's nights, the same presence that had slipped behind a dumpster when Harris gave chase, was still near. As dawn broke over Austin, Maple Street was no longer just a neighborhood. It had become a hunting ground. Under the soft glow of the street lamps, Maple Street looked like a place suspended between two realities. On one side, the calm of everyday life tried to reassert itself. Cars parked neatly along the sidewalks, curtains drawn across the front windows of small suburban homes. Children's bicycles left leaning on fences, as if their owners would return at any moment. On the other side, however, the scars of the fire still pulsed like open wounds. The char husks of two houses stood in stark silhouette, their roofs caved in, their skeletal frames still blackened with soot. Even the air smelled heavy, as though smoke had sunk deep into the soil and refused to let go. It had been nearly 3 weeks since that October night, when flames swallowed the quietness of Austin's Maple Street. But the residents still spoke of it in hushed tones, as though raising their voices might reignite the inferno. John Carter, who had lived on Maple Street for more than 15 years, still woke in the early hours with the crackle of fire echoing in his mind. He had been one of the first to notice the orange glow spreading across his neighbor's porch roof, and the memory of running barefoot across the cool pavement to bang on the door remained as vivid as the burn mark on his right palm, where a falling ember had landed. On the evening of October 12th, the fire had broken out just after 9:30. It was a Sunday, and most families were winding down their weekend routines. Sarah Mitchell, a young mother of 2, had been putting her children to bed when the sharp smell of burning timber reached her nose. At first, she thought one of her neighbors might have lit a backyard fire pit, but when she glanced out the window, her breath caught. A thick plume of black smoke was rising, and the light of the flames reflected off her living room glass. She grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and pulled her children from their beds with trembling hands. By the time the first engines arrived, the flames had already leapt across the hedges that separated the Harris residence from a vacant property next door. Witnesses later said the fire moved like it was alive, twisting and curling, finding every dry board and beam to consume. Austin Fire Department's Captain Luis Hernandez was among the first responders. He remembered the heat being so intense that even standing at a distance felt unbearable, as though the air itself had thickened with fire. He barked orders into his radio, his crew unfurling hoses, while neighbors stood on the pavement in stunned silence, their faces lit by the terrible dance of the flames. What made the night even more haunting was the uncertainty about who might still be inside. Mr. and Mrs. Harris were known for their reclusive habits. They were both in their late 60s, rarely seen outside except for the occasional trip to the grocery store. Rumors swirled that Mr. Harris was not in good health, and as the fire consumed their home, shouts broke out among the crowd. "Are they inside? Did anyone see them?" Some tried to rush forward, but the firefighters held them back, reminding them of the danger. No one wanted to watch helplessly, yet no one dared to defy the wall of fire. Even as the blaze roared, strange details began to unsettle the onlookers. Several residents swore they had heard a loud popping sound moments before the fire erupted, almost like an explosion. Others insisted they saw a shadowy figure running down the street, disappearing into the night just as the first flames licked the Harris's front porch. Police took notes, but amid the chaos, the priority was saving lives. Neighbors were evacuated, hoses thundered, and water hissed against the inferno. Yet for all the effort, the fire raged for more than an hour before firefighters could bring it under control. By then, Both houses were gone, reduced to smoldering ruins. In the following days, Maple Street became a site of both mourning and speculation. The Harris couple was unaccounted for, and while no bodies had yet been discovered, hope was fragile. Detectives from the Austin Police Department cordoned off the area, combing through the debris. Reporters gathered at the end of the street, shoving microphones toward anyone willing to speak. For residents like John Carter and Sarah Mitchell, the invasion of cameras and questions only deepened their unease. They were still grappling with the trauma of what they had witnessed, still waking at night to phantom smoke, and now they had to relive it under the glare of public scrutiny. On the evening of October 17th, a community meeting was held at the local church hall. Folding chairs filled the room. The smell of burnt was still clinging to the clothes of those who attended. Captain Hernandez stood at the front, his uniform pressed but his eyes tired. He explained what was known so far, that the fire appeared to have started on the Harris's porch, that the speed of its spread suggested an accelerant, and that the cause was officially listed as suspicious. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded grimly, convinced their earlier suspicions were correct. Others whispered anxiously, wondering what it meant that their neighborhood might have been targeted. It was during this meeting that a new layer of mystery emerged. A woman named Linda Bowman, who lived 2 blocks away, raised her hand. Her voice shook as she said that on the afternoon before the fire, she had seen a man in a dark jacket standing near the Harris's mailbox, just staring at the house. She hadn't thought much of it at the time, assuming he was lost or waiting for someone. But now, in light of the fire, she felt compelled to share. Captain Hernandez took her statement carefully, his expression unreadable, but the room buzzed with speculation once more. Who was the man, and why had he been watching the house? As nights passed, the unease deepened. Residents who once felt secure in their suburban routines now triple-checked their locks, peeked through blinds at the faintest sound, and left porch lights burning until dawn. Children whispered of seeing strange shadows moving among the ruins, and some adults admitted they too felt as though Maple Street had changed, its air charged with nervous energy. The fire had not only destroyed houses, it had unsettled the very spirit of the neighborhood. And so, even as the investigation unfolded, life on Maple Street carried on in a strange half-light. School buses still arrived each morning. Dogs still barked at passing cars. But beneath it all was a tension that never quite eased. The fire had left behind more than ashes. It had left behind questions that no one yet had answers to. And for those who lived there, the waiting, the wondering, and the watching were almost as unbearable as the night of the flames itself. Would you like me to continue from this point by exploring the ongoing investigation, digging deeper into the mysterious man in the dark jacket and the possibility of arson? Or would you prefer I expand more on the emotional and social aftermath within the neighborhood before we step into the darker mystery? The investigation moved slowly, much too slowly for the families who lived along Maple Street. Each day, uniformed officers in marked cars arrived and parked by the charred remains, setting up tape and pushing back the curious. For the neighbors, it was impossible to ignore the black skeletons of the Harris residence and the vacant property. Beside it loomed like constant reminders, shadows that never disappeared even under the bright Texas sun. Detective Raymond Clark had been assigned to the case. A tall, quiet man in his mid-40s with graying hair at his temples. He was known for his patience and his unwillingness to let details slip past him. He walked the perimeter again and again, sometimes crouching down, sometimes just standing in stillness, as if listening for something no one else could hear. What caught his attention most were the odd scorch marks at the base of the porch stairs, marks that didn't match the rest of the burn pattern. He suspected accelerant had been poured there, soaking into it long before the flames erupted. Meanwhile, life pressed on awkwardly for the neighbors. Sarah Mitchell avoided walking past the ruins with her children, guiding them along the opposite side of the road instead. She didn't want them asking more questions, especially about the rumors spreading from house to house. One night, her 7-year-old son whispered to her that he had seen a figure standing near the Harris's mailbox again, just as Mrs. Bowman had described at the church hall. Sarah told him it was only his imagination, but she could not deny the chill that ran down her spine. At the corner of the street lived an elderly man, Robert Lewis, who had spent most of his retirement tending to his garden and watching the neighborhood from his porch. He swore he heard someone walking through the rubble at 2 a.m. a few days after the fire. When he peered out through his lace curtains, he claimed he saw a man carrying a small flashlight, moving carefully as though searching for something. By the time Robert grabbed his phone to call the police, the figure had disappeared into the night. Detective Clark noted Robert's story, though he treated it cautiously. Grief and fear often clouded memory. Still, when he compared Robert's account with the earlier statement from Linda Bowman and the whispered words of Sarah's young son, he began to see a troubling thread. The possibility grew in his mind that someone wasn't finished with Maple Street, that whoever had started the fire might return. The unease began to shape the rhythm of the neighborhood. Doors that once stood open on warm evenings now stayed firmly locked. Conversations at the local grocery store circled endlessly around the same questions. Why had the Harris house been targeted? Was it random, or was there some darker reason? Nobody seemed to know much about the Harrises, except that they kept to themselves and rarely had visitors. Theories swirled. Some thought it might have been an accident, faulty wiring, or an old heater sparking at the wrong time. Others, more suspicious, whispered of debts, arguments, or secrets long buried. At the same time, the absence of the Harris couple gnawed at everyone's conscience. Weeks had passed, yet there was still no sign of them. No bodies had been found, no relatives had come forward, and no one seemed to know where they might have gone. For many on Maple Street, the mystery of their fate was more haunting than the fire itself. One late afternoon, as the October sun sank low and painted the sky in shades of rust and purple, John Carter found himself standing near the edge of the ruins. He wasn't sure why he had wandered there. Perhaps it was a need to face the fear head-on, or perhaps it was something heavier, guilt, maybe, for not being able to do more that night. As he stood there, the faint scent of smoke still lingering in the air, he noticed something half buried beneath the ashes near what had once been the front porch. It was a metal box, scorched and bent but still intact. Curiosity overcame him. He crouched down, pulled it free, and carried it home. Under the brighter light of his kitchen, he worked the rusted latch until it clicked open. Inside, to his surprise, were several papers, singed but legible. There were letters, receipts, and what looked like old photographs. One photo in particular made his blood run cold. A black and white picture of a man standing in front of the Harris house, decades younger, yet unmistakably the same figure some neighbors had described recently. The man in the dark jacket. John sat at his kitchen table for a long time, staring at the photo. The implications gnawed at him. Could this man have been watching the Harris house for years? What connection did he have to them? And why had the picture been hidden away in a metal box? He debated whether to keep it to himself, but finally he called Detective Clark. Within the hour, Clark arrived, his sharp eyes studying the photograph with deep concentration. "This changes things," Clark murmured, almost to himself. "This man isn't just some stranger lurking in the night. He's tied to this place, and maybe to the Harrises themselves." Word spread quickly after Clark began questioning neighbors again, this time armed with the photograph. Some claimed to have seen the man in years past, though never often, and always at a distance. Others swore they had never seen him at all. The uncertainty only deepened the sense of dread. As Halloween approached, the tension in Maple Street thickened. Parents debated canceling trick-or-treating, fearful of strangers moving among the children in the dark. Porch decorations, usually cheerful and playful, now looked eerie under the weight of recent events. Pumpkins with crooked grins and plastic skeletons felt less like holiday fun and more like grim omens. It was on the night of October 30th, as the neighborhood tried to settle, that Sarah Mitchell was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps on her porch. Her heart hammered as she crept to the window, peeking through the blinds. There, illuminated faintly by the street lamp, stood a man in a dark jacket. His face was partly shadowed, but the outline matched the photo she had seen only 2 days earlier when Clark had shown it to her. She froze, barely daring to breathe. The man did not knock, nor did he attempt to enter. He simply stood there for what felt like minutes, then slowly walked away into the night, his figure dissolving into the shadows of Maple Street. Sarah dialed Clark immediately, her voice shaking as she described what she had seen. When officers arrived minutes later, the street was empty. No footprints remained, no evidence except her trembling memory. By the time November rolled in, Maple Street was a neighborhood living in the grip of quiet terror. People spoke less openly, eyes darting more often to the charred ruins that had once been ordinary homes. And through it all, Detective Clark pressed forward, convinced that the fire had been no accident, that the missing Harises were the key, and that the man in the dark jacket, who seemed to step in and out of the night like a shadow, held the answers to everything. But those answers were not yet within reach. And for the families of Maple Street, the waiting continued, each night heavier than the last, as if the fire's glow had never truly gone out. The chill of November settled over Austin with a quiet persistence. On Maple Street, the leaves had begun to fall in slow spirals, gathering in small piles along the sidewalks and in the corners of chain-link fences. The ordinary rhythm of autumn should have brought comfort. Children crunching through the leaves, neighbors exchanging greetings as they raked their lawns. But instead there was an uneasy stillness, as though the street itself had grown wary of its own shadows. Detective Clark returned often, his car parked discreetly at the far end of the block. He liked to walk the length of the street at dusk, his footsteps deliberate, his eyes scanning everything from broken porch lights to the angles of curtains pulled too quickly. Each evening, some of the neighbors peeked through their blinds, wondering if his presence meant progress or only more unanswered questions. The metal box John Carter had discovered still lingered in Clark's thoughts. He had studied the photograph carefully, even sent it to the forensic unit for enhancement. The result had only deepened the mystery. The figure's features were sharp enough to identify a man in his 40s at the time the picture was taken, tall, with sunken eyes and a narrow jawline. Yet when Clark cross-checked the image with missing persons, criminal records, and local archives, nothing concrete surfaced. It was as though the man had existed only in the frame of that photo. John, restless after finding the box, began to feel a growing sense of responsibility. At night, he sometimes sat by his living room window, watching the street as though expecting the man to appear again. His wife warned him not to get too involved, but John could not shake the memory of the heat that had nearly taken his own life. He felt bound to find some meaning in what had happened. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell grew increasingly uneasy. Since the night she had seen the man on her porch, she had struggled to sleep. Every creak of her house felt magnified. Every shadow stretched too long. Her children, perceptive in ways that only children can be, noticed her nervousness. They asked fewer questions about the fire, but they clung to her more often, unwilling to fall asleep without the hallway light on. One Saturday morning, just as the sun began to rise, Sarah went outside to collect a newspaper. As she bent down, she noticed something unusual at the edge of her lawn, a single photograph, half buried in the dew-soaked grass. She lifted it with trembling fingers. It was another old black-and-white photo, this time of the Harris house itself, but from a much earlier time, judging by the cars parked along the curb, perhaps the 1960s. And again, faintly, almost in the corner of the frame, stood the same man in the dark jacket, watching from the sidewalk. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her, and called Clark immediately. When he arrived, he studied the photo with the same grim intensity as before. "Someone placed this here," he said firmly. "It wasn't lost or blown by the wind. Whoever is behind this wants you to see it." This revelation spread quickly through the neighborhood, and with it came a wave of paranoia. If the man was leaving clues, then he was still here, walking among them, perhaps even watching them at that very moment. Some neighbors spoke openly of moving away, selling their homes to escape the fear. Others grew more defiant, installing cameras, buying larger locks, and keeping baseball bats near their beds. Then came another twist. In late November, as crews finally cleared some of the debris from the Harris property, workers uncovered a small, hidden space beneath the floorboards of what had been the living room. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, brittle with age, and a few personal belongings: an old wristwatch, a faded diary, and several envelopes sealed and unmarked. The diary, once deciphered, contained fragments of entries written in a shaky hand. The author, believed to be Mr. Harris, wrote of feeling watched, of hearing footsteps outside his window at night, of a man from the past who would not leave them in peace. Detective Clark read the entries aloud at the station, his brow furrowed. The last few pages were nearly illegible, written in hurried scrawl, but one line repeated itself again and again. "He is waiting for the fire." When word of the diary spread, Maple Street was consumed by speculation. Some believed the Harises had been tormented for years, haunted by this figure who appeared in photographs across decades. Others wondered if the Harises themselves were hiding something, if their reclusive lives masked a history no one had ever uncovered. Theories multiplied until the line between fact and rumor blurred. December arrived, and with it the promise of winter holidays. Normally, Maple Street would be alive with decorations, twinkling lights strung across porches, wreaths hanging on doors, the laughter of children building makeshift snowmen when the rare Texas frost appeared. This year, however, the cheer was muted. A few families hung lights, but they glowed faintly, half-hearted against the heavy atmosphere. The burned lots still gaped like wounds, and the mystery of the man in the jacket overshadowed every attempt at joy. One cold night, as the clock neared midnight, Robert Lewis again found himself awake. He shuffled to his kitchen for a glass of water, then paused by his window. At the far end of Maple Street, near the lamplight that barely worked, he saw movement. A man, tall, shoulders hunched, stood watching the ruins of the Harris house. He didn't move, didn't turn, didn't even shift his weight. He just stood there as though rooted in place. Robert's hand shook so badly that he nearly dropped his glass. By the time he gathered the courage to fetch his phone, the figure was gone. Robert told Clark the next morning. The detective listened, then asked the old man a simple question. "Did he look real to you? Flesh and blood, or something else?" Robert hesitated for a long time before answering. "I don't know," he whispered. "That's what scares me the most." Through the rest of December, the sightings multiplied. A teenager walking home late swore he saw the man watching from behind a tree. A delivery driver claimed someone in a dark jacket stood in the road, forcing him to brake hard, only to vanish when he stepped out of the van. Even Clark himself, during one of his dusk walks, thought he caught a glimpse of a shadow slipping between two houses, though when he searched, nothing remained. The fire on Maple Street had burned away more than wood and brick. It had stripped away certainty, leaving only questions that grew heavier with time. Was a man in the photograph's flesh and blood an arsonist obsessed with the Harises? Or was he something older, a presence tied to the land, surfacing to the decades like a curse? For the families still living there, the answer mattered less than the reality. They were being watched. And as the year edged toward its close, the unease deepened, pressing against every locked door and drawn curtain. Maple Street waited, restless and afraid, for whatever would come next.
As winter passed and spring crept slowly back into Austin, the people of Maple Street tried to believe that the fire, and everything it had left behind, was fading into the past. The ruins were finally cleared, leaving behind 2 empty lots, flat and bare, as though the houses had never stood there at all. Fresh grass began to sprout, birds returned to perch on the telephone wires, and the ordinary sounds of suburban life resumed. But underneath the return of normalcy lingered a silence no one could explain. Families still drew their curtains earlier than before, still left porch lights burning long into the night, and still lowered their voices when conversations brushed against the subject of the fire. Detective Clark eventually closed the file, citing insufficient evidence to pursue charges. The Harris couple was never found. The man in the dark jacket never identified. The photographs, the diary, the sightings, each piece was marked as inconclusive, unable to stand as proof of anything. Officially, Maple Street's fire remained a tragedy without resolution. Unofficially, however, the story continued to breathe. Children whispered about the man when walking home from school. Adults, though reluctant to admit it, sometimes still felt eyes on them when they passed the empty lots at dusk. Some swore they caught glimpses of a figure standing just at the edge of their vision. Always tall, always in a dark jacket, always watching. Years later, newcomers moved into Maple Street. They built new homes on the cleared land, painted their walls, planted flowers, and tried to fill the air with laughter again. Yet even they soon learned that when night fell and the wind moved strangely between the houses, the street seemed to remember. And for those who had been there on that October night, for those who had smelled the smoke, seen the flames, and heard the whispers that followed, the truth was impossible to deny. The fire on Maple Street had never truly gone out. It smoldered still, quiet, unseen, waiting.